Afternoon all. I really enjoyed the 4NCL weekend just gone, and one of the reasons I wanted to go, to see what it's like and maybe be more comfortable in video annotating games from the 4NCL. Now in Division 1 there was a fantastic pairing between two grandmasters when the Jutes of Kent played Wood Green Hilsmark 1, and representing Wood Green with black was Michael Adams 2735, and with white Simon Williams 2506. So Simon kicked off with D4. Simon does excellent videos himself, by the way, on things like the French defence. He's an expert in the Dutch. Michael Adams, he responded with a very solid, as though he's going to play a Nimzo Indian. If white plays knight c3, he might consider maybe bishop e4. But white played knight f3, and a very solid continuation indeed, d5. And after knight c3, bishop e7. Well, there's a question here for a sort of dynamic aggressive player like myself, who usually plays things like the King's Engine and other stuff like that, is what is the kind of aggression behind black's setup? Is black actually just trying to secure a solid draw? But the plan we're about to witness in this game, well, the bishop is going to be fianchetto later, and black is going to accept hanging pawns, what's called hanging pawns, as we'll see when black strives for c5 later. So although it looks like black might just be content with a draw, it's not only solid, it's kind of aggressive. And look in particular throughout this game at black's rooks. If we transition this to hanging pawns, which is black's plan, look at the activity of black's rooks and knights in particular, if you want to make a note of that. The way black activates his position through the c5 strategy, which we're about to see later. So bishop f4, after castle's now a3. Now we see the bishop's fianchetto. So b6. And white plays actually now c takes d5, and interestingly, not e takes d5, which may be many of our choices, but actually, well, with the bishop potentially going to b7, or even maybe a6 sometimes, it's not necessary to liberate the bishop on this diagonal in any case. So Adams's move here is actually to take with the knight. So he's attacking f4 and c3, and white perhaps doesn't want bishop g3, knight takes c3. There's some structural damage, a little bit of structural damage. These two pawns, you might want to keep them intact. So knight takes d5 was played. Now e takes d. Okay. Now after queen c2, we're going to see this first little plan of accepting. Black's going to accept hanging pawns now. He plays c5. So what seems to be a very solid setup from black has got this potential aggression that he really wants to activate his rooks. And you might think, well, how does playing for hanging pawns here activate, say, this rook? Well, it's going to be the b file. If white ever takes like this, black will get b file pressure. So make a note of that potential for this rook quality to go up, using that b file road of the hanging pawns. Around often structural weaknesses, there is dynamic compensation if you can get it, if you don't lose all your pawns in the process, like I've recently done. But sometimes double pawns and hanging pawns are great for getting pressure. So we're going to see here now, d takes c5 was played by white. Black doesn't really want to play bishop takes c5. It gives not only this isolated pawn, but the potential grip white has on d4 means this looks like a position black wants to avoid. So b takes c5. The structure is set here. If you look at that b file, it's got potential later for a rook, and also this e file's got potential as well. So either side of the hanging pawns, there's these two important activity files for black rooks. Now white tries a strategy which looks reminiscent of a Fischer-Spassky game from the 1972 World Championship match. One of the classic ideas around hanging pawns is often to fix them, to encourage them to be fixed, and maybe, in this case, to lock down the light square. So white's next move, e4, would seem to tick that box. Now, does black really want to play d4? Doesn't it look as though in this position now, black does play d4? Doesn't it look as though there's an uncomfortable bind and grip on the light squares? But bear in mind the dynamic compensation on the B file and potentially pressure on E4 later. Okay, so we see now bishop D3, and now an immediate challenge is made to that D3 bishop. Bishop A6, making use of the fact that the knight hasn't moved yet, it can support bishop A6. White castles, and now bishop takes D3. So in terms of the blockadability of these hanging pawns, it's a little bit less without white having the light squared bishop. And now the knight can go to a very comfortable square, knight C6. So the pawn structure looks actually to offer black dynamism. If you look, there's potential moves which are going to hit B2 soon. Okay, the bishop's eyeing B8, so it rules out any rook B8 for the moment. Rook Fc1, and that's another classic thing to try and attack that base of the hanging pawns, the exploitable base. Queen B6, not only defending but also attacking. Knight D2, increasing the iron grip, it seems, on the C4 square. The light squares want to be in white's grip here, but black's pressure is made a little bit more annoying now with A5. Not only discouraging potential B4s, but also Queen A6 is made available. If Knight C4, maybe Queen A6. And indeed, this is the case of what happens now. So can we say that black's hanging pawns are a major liability here? It looks as though they're simply offering all of black's pieces good opportunities here. After Knight C4, Queen A6. And it's a bit of an annoying kind of pin. But now a shift to the king side, and it does look as though white is imitating still the kind of Fischer-Spassky strategy against the Tartakower variation, which also resulted in hanging pawns in the 1972 match. But this shift to the king side attack, is it actually that convincing in this particular position? Black plays now rook Fe8. Okay, so the bishop potentially can be tucked on F8 if needed. Now actually bishop D6. And now G6, offering some weaknesses on the dark squares. So what's the idea behind this G6? Okay, well, we're about to see F4, and it looks as though, you know, is white trying to develop an attack over here, or simply maybe not play for F5 but E5, maybe to establish a knight on D6 later. But now a curious move actually, D3. D3, just sacking a pawn here, making a gambit out of it. It seems, you know, as soon as that F4 was played, there are some potential weaknesses on the dark squares. But what is going on here after D3? I'm not really 100% sure. Let's examine a continuation such as an immediate queen takes D3. Let's stick on an engine here in this position. So D3, let's imagine queen takes D3. It looks as though engines actually like black here, but maybe in this position the engine likes white for a moment. So let's play D3. Bishop takes D6, so there's no knight takes D6 because queen takes. So queen takes and E4. That makes sense. And it looks as though black has no problems here. For example, knight E5 could take the queen maybe. Or even stronger apparently, another strong move. Queen A7. I think maybe taking the queen's not so hot, but playable as well. I think Queen A7 actually relies on a little tactic. Then if Queen takes C5, that would be a disaster. There's a rook E1 check, winning a rook. But anyway, let's get back to the game continuation. This D3 is left hang in another move now after bishop E7, rook E7 here. And it seems the engine quite fancies queen takes D3 here. So let's look at it now. If queen takes D3 was played here, let's imagine rook D8, queen E3. Now, is there something strong for black? Maybe Simon didn't like this particular position because rook D4, maybe he was more worried about rook D4 rather than knight D4. Rook D4 seems quite pleasant for black, not only hitting C4 but also E4. If white's moving onto the defensive, maybe this starts to look quite unpleasant. This is not a position which maybe Simon wanted. Queen d3, although it seems as though maybe there is enough robustness in white's position. Knight d4 would also threaten knight d3. And if rook takes, then knight takes. It seems white might have been okay here. But I think Simon wanted to go for an attack and not just maybe get a passive, potentially passive position. So his next move, knight d2, and it seems unfortunately that white does go passive, but he does, knight d2 does facilitate a switch to a kingside attack. He wants to get onto the dark squares, and it reminds me of my a little bit of my game where I just started giving up until to try and get an attack. But it myself, sometimes if you're frustrated, it can lead to this, that you just try and roll the dice here. So is this trying to go in for attack? Well, the thing is, white's about to sacrifice the exchange now after queen g5, rook b7. The position all of a sudden looks quite miserable. This b file pressure is quite intense. Of course, there's threats like knight e2 check here. White plays a seemingly miserable looking passive move. After knight c2, okay, he gives up the exchange, but what else? If rook a2 here doesn't look particularly appetizing. Let's actually just check what would happen after rook a2. Maybe queen b6, queen e6. That's even stronger. Queen e6 looks like an incisive move. And if queen d5 can just take, and then rook d8, and it's fairly unpleasant. Apparently, well, this doesn't look very pleasant. That dislocated pawn on d5. So basically, maybe white is actually forced to do something desperate and go for the attack. Final try in this game. e5, sack the exchange, go for the attack. There's quite a clinical defense coming up though after winning the rook. Okay, it's not recaptured yet, just knight e4. So it looks quite dangerous actually. Knight f6 and queen h6 to be fair. These guys are all over here, but now the queen comes into c4. Okay, hitting the knight, asking the knight to do something. So it goes check to king g7. Now knight g4. So it still looks dangerous with you know, ideas of mating the king. The king makes a run for it here. King f8, quite elegantly maybe one could argue. Queen f6, and now this check proves to be useful, unfortunately, for Simon, because now the queen can be challenged on those dark squares with queen d8. A check is thrown in, and now queen f6 perhaps is not too harmful for black. Let's have a quick look. I imagine just king d7 and black will be fine. So queen f6, let's say king d7, check, and the attack might be running out of steam here. After rook takes a1, just queen d7. Okay, the attack's run out of steam. Max Bella. So in the game, actually, in this position, white played queen takes h7. Clearly things have gone wrong, and now this brutal queen h8 gets the queens off. White resigned here. I thought the game was interesting, well from a few angles actually, because really it looks as though, is black playing a solid position here with the Tasko system or an aggressive system? It seems the aggression is really brought out by accepting the hanging pawns, and the aggression is further brought out by this kind of undermining of the light square blockade, and later pawn sack, which looked very dangerous for white. And while it wasn't accepted, black was getting lots of squares after this d4 anyway. The d4 square, d-file usage, e4 was becoming vulnerable. The move g6, one could argue, was a bit curious actually in this position. I wonder what the actual idea, just very, very quickly here in overview. G6 is actually a liked move by the engine. What is the idea of G6? Interesting. Very interesting. So if g6 wasn't played, let's imagine bishop f8 takes, rook takes, knight d6. Maybe there's an idea of coming into f5, which could be useful, which would prompt g6 anyway, and also c5 would be attacked now. It's looking a bit dangerous actually, this position. So g6 is a kind of prophylactic move. Let's try and stop this engine before it melts down the CPU here. So let's go back. So g6 kind of against maybe taking knight d6 to f5, which also hits that. So in this position, f4 and then now d3. So it seems black is generating a lot of counterplay here from what was just seemingly a solid like opening choice, is now like hyper aggressive rooks and knights, and there's no problem piece for black, but he has to incisively hopping back through the center with that tempo gain is great for dark square defense here, as this is about to demonstrate. So we see this king f8 and this check queen d8 to the rescue of the king. Okay, I hope you got something from that. I thought it was quite interesting, from hanging pawns and dynamism, from a seemingly solid opening. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.